Millionaire catches poor maid protecting his elderly mother. What happens next shocking? He stood at the top of the marble stairs and watched her with a slow, stunned kind of anger. The man who had everything felt empty in the place that held pride. He did not expect mercy. He expected a thief. He did not expect to find a daughter. She had been cleaning the hallway for years. Her hands knew the corners of that house better than anyone's. Her name was Jasmine, and the house was a mansion that owned the city's silence at night. She moved like a shadow, quick, steady, unnoticed. She had learned to be small in the world of suitcases and silver trays. People stepped around her as if she belonged to the floor. On that afternoon, something broke the practice of being invisible. His mother, a woman of sharp eyes and brittle kindness, had slipped in the bathroom. Alone and thin, she could not call out. The maid found her on the cold tile, a tangle of limbs and regret. Jasmine did not stand and call for help. She did not run to the front door and ring for the driver. She sank beside the old woman, held her wrist, and whispered prayers in a language the mansion had never heard. The millionaire watched from the landing. He had been coming home early to surprise his mother for her birthday. He expected flowers, or at least someone to greet him. Instead, he watched the woman he had paid all these years sit on the floor and cradle his mother like a child. There was a softness in the maid's face that did not match the economy of her uniform. For a long moment he froze. Pride and suspicion warred inside him. A lifetime of assumptions tightened like chains. He descended the stairs without a sound. He had power, money, lawyers, and secrets tucked into safe deposit boxes. He also had a fragile heart that had been hidden for years. Curiosity pulled him toward the two figures on the bathroom tile. He could not have guessed the truth he would find there. Before we continue, please share your city in the comments, and remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the story. Now let's continue. Jasmine's life had been measured in small things. She kept to a rhythm of chores, careful not to wake memories that belonged to her own past. Years ago, she had a son who grew up in a neighborhood that the city liked to forget. She had loved him with a full and private fire that kept her moving through hard days. But fate had a different plan. Sickness took her boy when he was only 7. The loss hollowed a space inside her that no job could fill. She left the neighborhood with the weight of a grief she carried like a second coat. Stephen built his empire from chance and stubbornness. He learned early to place masks on his face. The world demanded a certain hardness, and he supplied it. People whispered about him at charity gala dinners and in boardrooms. He was a genius with numbers, ruthless in deals, and kind in public ways that layered control. His mother, Lillian, had once been his anchor. She taught him the value of honesty. Even as she softened the edges he had sharpened. As she aged, her meaning in his life deepened in a quiet way he had not noticed until it began to thin. On the floor of that bathroom, Jasmine did not think of houses or money. She thought of warmth, of a small hand folded into hers, of the sound of a child's breath. She thought of the way the old woman's face seemed like a map of someone who had also known loss. When Stephen stepped into the doorway, Jasmine looked up at him. Her face had the raw, open honesty of someone who had nowhere left to hide. Stephen's first reaction was sharp and cold. Someone had moved past the boundary of employer and worker. Someone had touched his mother in a way that he had expected only his own hands to do. He wanted to pull her away, to assert a neat line of authority. He felt a sting of betrayal that surprised him. How dare she, he thought, while part of him admired the care. He forced himself to breathe. Lillian opened her eyes and saw Stephen. For a split instant, she smiled with the simplicity of someone who had known children and hope and lullabies. She reached a trembling hand toward Stephen, but it thinned like fog before it reached him. Her lips moved. The name she could say was not his. She said, "Mama," and looked at Jasmine with a fierce and loving recognition. Stephen stepped closer. He knelt, framed between the tiles and the bathtub. He felt a sudden urgency that had nothing to do with business. The man who had bargained for hard things found himself fumbling with the lock on the bathroom door because Jasmine had the keys, because Jasmine was the only person with the patience to sit while an old woman's heart slowed and started again. After the ambulance and the doctor and the polite flutter of concern from staff, Stephen remained in a private corner of the mansion, trying to piece together what he had seen. He watched Jasmine from afar for days, noting how she arranged Lillian's blanket, how she hummed old songs that made the house remember gentle afternoons. Something deeper than curiosity reached into him. It was a memory he could not place, a pull toward something beyond the ledger books and appointment times. Jasmine kept her own secrets like a wallet of faded photographs. She had a thin scar along her wrist from where she had once held her son too tightly and tried to keep the sickness away. She had a little blue thread tied into her apron as a talisman. When she changed Lillian's pillows, she smoothed the fabric with the careful motions of someone who had not been taught to love by example. Loving, for Jasmine, was an instinct that shaped her hands and softened her eyes. Stephen arranged a meeting with Human Resources, not to scold Jasmine, but to know her story. She sat in the bright office with a quiet dignity, answering questions in short syllables, in measured tones that hinted at a life of compacted grief. He learned about the neighborhood she came from, about a son with a laugh that sounded like rain against metal. Each fact stitched a small reveal of a woman who had been resilient enough to stand when life pressed her down. Over weeks, their relationship shifted in little visible ways. Stephen would leave a cup of tea on the table in the staff room. Jasmine would find an extra towel in the coat closet. There were echoing silences between them that felt like the space before confession. Stephen found himself listening for the sound of her humming in the morning. He began to schedule his visits home more often, insisting on affairs of convenience, like taking his mother to the park for a short walk. He wanted to watch Jasmine when she moved through the rooms at dawn with the quiet duty of someone who loves without asking. One rainy evening, Stephen saw Jasmine rush out into a storm, and he followed her. She had heard a small noise from a wastebasket outside, a rustle like a frightened bird. There, hiding in a bundle of damp clothes, was a little boy no older than 5. His face was thin and pale, and he clung to a small stuffed rabbit whose ear was chewed into a tiny moon. Jasmine had found him wandering near the back gate of the mansion, clothes too thin for the season, eyes wide with hunger. Jasmine did not call the police. She wrapped the boy in her own shawl and carried him into a distant pantry until she could quietly fetch blankets and soup. Stephen watched this through the side window, as if observing a secret play. His heart moved without permission. He saw in Jasmine the raw thread of maternal instinct, the echo of loss that made her reach for a child who was not her son, but could be a son again. That night, after the boy was safe and sleeping in a small cot behind the pantry, Stephen sat in the study and thought about his own childhood. He remembered his mother singing lullabies in a low voice when the house was new. He had not thought of those songs in years. He had thought, instead of meetings, of acquisitions, of winning. He had forgotten the small, human things that built a life. The next morning, Stephen offered Jasmine something she would not readily accept: permission to take a day off to look after the boy and bring him to the children's shelter. She shook her head at first, wary of attention, but the look in Stephen's eyes was neither pity nor ownership. It was understanding. Jasmine accepted, and for the first time she felt the weight of the world lighten. As the days turned into weeks, the boy, named Donald by those at the shelter, became a quiet miracle in a life that had known too many endings. Jasmine visited the shelter and brought small gifts, a knitted hat, a paper boat. Stephen funded the shelter without making any announcement. He began to see the world beyond his towers, not as a place to dominate, but as a place that might need steady hands. Their connection deepened. Stephen found himself protecting Jasmine from small cruelties. A gruff manager who made jokes about staff, a socialite who assumed Jasmine's life was simple. He would step in with a calm voice that made people clear space for her. Jasmine, in turn, taught him how to listen. She showed him how the sound of a kettle boiling could tell you everything about someone's morning. She taught him to sit in silence, without the urge to win something. But the world that had shaped them did not vanish. Rumors began to circulate through the staff quarters. Some whispered that Stephen wanted to make Jasmine a personal companion beyond her duties. Others suggested the millionaire was searching for an heir or crafting a public image. Gossip, like a weed, grows quickly when there is a space of power. Jasmine kept her head down. She did not fight rumors with words. Her past had taught her that silence could be armor. She did not want the pity of charity or the glare of scrutiny. She wanted to continue to serve, to offer small kindnesses, and to keep herself anchored in the duty she had chosen since grief had rearranged her life. The turning point came when Lillian's memory faltered in a new way. She began to imagine people who had passed away as if they were standing in the living room, calling her by old names. She would search for a husband who had long been gone. On a bright afternoon, she wandered out into the garden, seeking a friend from decades earlier, and got lost near the fountain. Jasmine found her and sat with her on the stone bench until the evening cooled. She held Lillian's hand and told her stories about little things that once made the world feel safe. But the family lawyer took note of Lillian's moments of confusion. He called a meeting with Stephen and suggested they move Lillian to a care facility where professionals could be around the clock. He mapped out the tidy equations of money, risk, and dignity. Stephen felt the old pressure to do what was efficient and respectable. He imagined society's approval of a decision that was convenient. Yet when he considered having someone else look after his mother, he also thought of Jasmine on the bathroom floor. Stephen realized that there was a different kind of care, one that could not be reduced to medical care alone. It was the kind that included stories, the smell of fresh bread, a familiar hand smoothing a blanket. Money could buy services, but it could not buy the quiet knowledge that came from time spent with someone who loved another in a way that did not keep score. He decided to hire a nurse, but this nurse would not replace Jasmine. Instead, Stephen wanted a team that blended medical skill with human warmth. He asked Jasmine if she would join the team not as a maid, but as a caregiver, recognized and paid fairly. She hesitated. Pride sat heavy on her shoulders. She did not want to be seen as someone who needed to be rescued or rewarded for doing what love made her do. When Stephen offered, he spoke not like a boss, but as a man who had learned a lesson about small mercies. He told her of his mother's birthdays and the photos of a young woman who once danced in the kitchen. He told her he had seen her on the bathroom floor and that he wanted her near his mother with dignity and compensation, not as a hidden staff member, but as a valued member of the care circle. Jasmine accepted. The arrangement became a new pattern. She moved between rooms with the authority of someone who belonged not only to the floor, but to the family's life. Lillian's eyes seemed brighter with the return of familiar songs and the smell of stewed fruit in the afternoons. Stephen found himself less hollowed by success. The mansion felt more like a home when the measured steps of a woman who had loved and lost moved through it freely. But peace, like glass, can crack when pushed. The son of a rival businessman visited the mansion during a charity event. He met Jasmine at a lowly moment, which the tabloids would later twist into a gossip piece about lovers and secret children. A photograph found its way into a social feed. Jasmine smiling beside Stephen as he handed her a bouquet in front of a staircase. Context was missing. The social machine filled that gap with speculation. Overnight, the story turned into something meaner. People wrote words they would not say to a face. Jasmine felt a change like a cold wind. She had wanted only to care for Lillian and perhaps, in the quiet hours, to remember the boy she had once held. Stephen, who had learned to read the world in contracts, discovered a truth that no spreadsheet could explain. Shame travels faster than truth. He watched as people projected their assumptions onto Jasmine and felt a hot anger for the injustice. He could buy silence and he could call lawyers, but he could not remove the small bruises left on a woman by words. One night, after a dinner where conversation scraped at the surface of civility, Stephen found Jasmine sitting in the courtyard under a street lamp. Rain dotted the stone. She cradled her hands around a warm cup of tea, staring at the sky as if it were a map she could not read. Stephen sat beside her without comment. For a long time they both listened to the rain. Finally, Jasmine spoke. She told him about a son named Kofi, who had laughed loud enough to fill a room. She told him about the hospital, the curtains, the way the light had been wrong the day the boy left. She did not ask for pity or payment. She only told. Her story slid out narrow and plain, like a rope to a far shore. Stephen listened and felt an ache that might have been compassion, or might have been guilt. He reached out and took her hand. It was a small thing, the kind of contact business people learn to avoid. But it mattered. It told her that she was seen. The next weeks were not easy. There were whispered comments at social events. There was a lawsuit threat from a furious investor who claimed Stephen's time and attention were being misused. He threatened to pull funding from a community project if Stephen did not resign certain responsibilities. The pressure was both personal and professional. Stephen's board asked difficult questions about his leadership. People who had envied his rise now waited for his fall. Stephen could have retreated, hidden behind legal papers and press statements. He could have bought silence from the tabloids. Instead, he chose precaution and honesty. He called a press conference, not to parade Jasmine or to confess to a melodrama, but to acknowledge a human truth, that people who serve quietly sometimes do more than 1,000 speeches by public figures. He spoke about his mother, about the fragility of life, and about a woman who had cared for them. He refused to let gossip shape the reality of his home. The press reacted unpredictably. Some outlets praised his candor. Others twisted and turned his words into new narratives. But the shelter received donations from unexpected places, and some neighbors who had never spoken to Jasmine brought her food in quiet hands. The tabloids moved on, hungry for the next outrage. Gradually, attention cooled. Jasmine's life steadied in a new balance. She worked with a nurse team and learned basics of medication management and physical therapy. She sat with Lillian in long afternoons and told stories about rain and old songs. Stephen learned to step back sometimes and leave the small things to others. He learned to sit still and listen, and in so doing found a certain peace he had traded away for years. Months passed. Lillian's condition did not magically recover. Memory would still falter like a tide, but there was less fear in the house. Lillian smiled more often. Sometimes she would clasp Jasmine's hand and say, "You remind me of someone I loved." Jasmine would smile without explaining that she had lost a child. There were mornings when the mansion smelled like warm bread and the small rituals that give days meaning. One day, Jasmine received a letter from her old neighborhood. A new clinic had opened, and the children, who had once raced in gutters, now had a chance at regular checkups. The letter invited caretakers who had experience with loss and trauma to speak with families. Jasmine felt a tug in her chest. She took leave and visited the clinic, and found herself sitting in a dim room with young mothers who held hands like boats. She told them about small things: how to make soups that comfort, how to make soft beds for fevered children, how to make a lullaby sound like steady water. Stephen watched this quietly from behind his papers and discovered pride in a way he had not known. He saw the woman who had once crouched on his mother's bathroom floor now standing in community rooms, teaching and listening. He felt the property of his chest shift. Pride here did not sting. It was soft and warmed by human connection. Conflict returned, not as sharp as before, but persistent. A distant cousin of Stephen's filed a claim against the estate, dredging up old wills and contested signatures. The claim worried the board and the lawyers. It touched upon the old fear in Stephen of losing control. In the center of a legal storm, someone suggested a settlement that would mean Lillian would move into a care facility. The suggestion knocked like a wind against the house. Jasmine sat at the foot of Lillian's bed and listened to the hospital calls and the lawyer's interface. She watched as Stephen fought not only for his mother's comfort, but also for the dignity of their small daily routines. He insisted that the family seek a solution that kept Lillian's bonds to familiar faces intact. He would not be bullied into a sterile, efficient choice that erased tenderness. They found a path, a legal arrangement that ensured Lillian would remain under a family-directed care plan, protected from predatory claims. Stephen reorganized his financial paperwork to shield his mother's care from litigation. He did not do it as a public gesture. He did it because someone had once held his mother's hand while she whispered stories of the past. The trial of life is not only in courtrooms, and it is not only in grand gestures. It is in small mornings and the way people choose to care for one another. Jasmine and Stephen learned to live within a fragile peace that required constant tending. They navigated suspicion, fame, and the quiet work of helping a once vibrant woman feel loved. One evening, as autumn folded its cool hands over the city, Lillian grew quiet and requested to see her old photo albums. She remembered faces and places in a way that startled Stephen. She turned pages with care and paused over a photograph of a young woman standing by a river, hair loose and laughing. She traced the outline of the woman with a wrinkled finger and whispered, "She reminds me of my sister." She looked up at Jasmine and smiled a smile that seemed to know them both. That small recognition felt like a benediction. Stephen felt a pressure release in his chest. He thought of the years he had spent valuing what glitters. He thought of the emptiness that had once been his companion and of the quiet, steady love that had changed him. People changed, sometimes slowly, sometimes with the force of a storm. The mansion had once been a house of trophies and contracts. Over time, it became the site of small, humane rituals. Jasmine continued her work, now officially recognized with a title that matched the value she brought. Stephen learned to measure success not only by the growth of his portfolio, but also by the warmth that filled the rooms of his home. Lillian kept a corner of her floor for the sunlight that woke the day. The shelter thrived with steady donors who were moved less by headlines than by real need. In the end, the thing that had surprised Stephen was not that wealth could help or harm, but that compassion could be as quietly powerful as money. A single act of care, performed without expectation, had a ripple effect. It saved a body, and it opened a life. It taught a man to slow down, and a woman to stand in the center of a family she had not been invited to before. Small routines, stirring a pot, smoothing a blanket, asking about a memory, became the stitches that mended frayed days. What did you feel reading this? Did the story move you? Would you like more stories like this one? Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the Beyond Yesterday YouTube channel to join our journey through small acts that change lives.